Hello.
Hi, yeah.
Hi, Moses. Are you okay?
Fine, things. Yes, no, we're ready.
Okay. Are we linked to any other centers?
Only Durban.
Only Durban. No, we're not linked to NNMU. No. No.
No other
No.
centers. No
No.
other centers.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. We will kick off. I guess this is a bad time of the year with universities all in chaos and crisis and students getting ready for exams. But welcome to everybody. My name is Jay Josie. I'm the head of the BRICS Research Center, and this is part of our BRICS seminar series program, which is co-sponsored by the Department of Science and Technology as well. We also do this in conjunction with the National Institute or the South African BRICS think tank, which is hosted by the National Institute of Higher Education of Social Sciences. And we will be having several other seminars, I think, before the end of the year, and next year we will continue again. We probably have a more logistically structured approach to the way we organize seminars next year. But without further ado, I want to hand over to our seminar speaker for today, Ms. Cattaneo. And Nikki is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and History at Rhodes University in Grahamstown. She has taught there since 1990. She is co-core director of our core African program on rethinking development economics and a member of the Department of Trade and Industry's Economic Research Advisory Network. Her research areas are trade and industrial policy, regional integration, and impact of the WTO and regional bilateral trade agreements on development policy spaces. She teaches trade and industrial policy and econometrics at Rhodes. She has a research linkage with TIPS, Trade and Industrial Policy Strategy, as well as the HSRC's BRICS Research Center. She holds an MSc in economics from Rhodes University, and Nikki is also one of the South African BRICS think tanks partners in the BRICS Academic Forum, and has presented several papers. Presented a paper this year in Moscow. The title of Nikki's paper is emanates from the academic forum that we had in Moscow in May this year, and it's trade policy, the WTO, and productive transformation strategies in the context of regional and bilateral trade agreements and perspectives from South Africa. This is looking at BRICS perspectives from South Africa. If you have the paper abstract, I'm not going to read it, so I'll give Nikki more time to go through it, and she will then give us a sense later on. And we'll have half an hour of presentation, and we'll have discussions until we close. Okay,
Thanks,
it's all yours.
Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? Moses, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Nikki.
Okay. Do you have the slides there?
Yes. Yeah. Can we sit now?
Thanks. We can see slides. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. If we can just have the outline slide. Next slide.
Yeah.
Right, thank you everybody. As Jay said, the paper that I'm going to speak to today is the one that was presented at the BRICS Academic Forum in Moscow in May. And in the context of the global financial crisis and shifts in the balance of economic power, globally, we see that the BRICS grouping has consolidated its presence through the formalization of a number of institutional arrangements in the last 2 years. These include, as we know, the new Development Bank, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, BRICS Business Council, as well as the Think Tanks Council. The BRICS countries at the moment are developing an agenda to promote deeper economic cooperation within the grouping, and they've also released joint position statements on a number of key areas related to the global economic and financial architecture. Prominent amongst these statements are the various summit statements since 2012 in particular, which expressed frustration at the slow pace of reform of the IMF and World Bank, and also strongly criticized the impact on emerging market economies of the monetary policy response of developed countries to the global financial crisis. At the sixth summit in Fortaleza, there is a BRICS perspective on international investment agreements that emerged, and there's also ongoing work on the development of a BRICS agenda for the reform of the WTO and the revision of key WTO agreements. Now, notwithstanding their growing influence, it's evident that in the current global environment, the BRICS countries need to be innovative in linking their trade, industrial, and technology policies to catch up with development. This is particularly the case because we see the broadening of WTO rulemaking to areas like services, investment, intellectual property protection, and government procurement. There have also been a number of emerging trends and challenges, including the proliferation of these regional and bilateral trade agreements arising from the WTO Doha impasse. Also an inclination towards plurilateral agreements within the WTO, which we'll come back to later on, and the potential impact of the mega-regional FTA negotiations to be considered. So the present paper has 4 parts. The first 3 of these explore South Africa's current trade and industrial policy position and its underlying rationale in this environment, as well as the country's policy approach on some of the new generation trade-related issues and the trends and challenges that I've mentioned above. Finally, the last part of the paper considers the lessons that can be learned from the South African perspective for moves to promote deeper economic cooperation within the BRICS grouping, as well as emerging BRICS positions and contradictions in some of these areas. Next slide, please, Moses. Right, that's very well. That's South Africa's trade and industrial policy since the late 2000s has been informed by the DTI's 2007 National Industrial Policy Framework. The goals of the IPF include diversification of the country's structure. Diversification of the country's productive structure towards non-traditional tradable goods and services, developing a more labour-absorbing industrialisation trajectory, and support for developing Africa's industrial capabilities. The NIPF document recognises the need for aligning and coordinating a range of policy areas in order for industrial policy to be effectively implemented. Of course, this includes appropriate macro and regulatory policies, skill and education, infrastructure development, and a supportive technology policy, as well as coordination with other areas of social policy. There are huge challenges in South Africa in this regard, to which we'll return later on. As far as trade policy is concerned, in the NIPF, trade policy is viewed as an instrument of industrial policy, and tariff policy in particular is aligned with the sector targeting priorities that are set out in the annual industrial policy action plans. The current approach involves the review and reduction of tariffs on critical inputs into downstream manufacturing, and where appropriate, retaining or using tariffs in strategic value adding and employment creating IPAP sectors, obviously within the limits set by South Africa's obligations at the multilateral and regional bilateral levels. Just as an aside at that point, the recent request from the steel sector for an across-the-board tariff increase on primary steel products provides something of a policy challenge in this regard. The NIPF further indicates that export promotion and diversification strategies, as well as foreign direct investment promotion, should be in line with industrial policy goals. So alongside the strategic use of tariffs, we've got the potential use of export taxes envisaged to encourage local beneficiation. Can we have the next slide, please, Noble? The DTI's 2010 Trade Policy and Strategy Framework document has two key aspects. First, it proposes a developmental trade policy in support of the country's industrial policy framework, and the document reinforces the strategic tariff policy outlined in the NIPF, where tariff policy is informed by industrial policy. The second key aspect of the 2010 Trade Policy Framework is the simultaneous pursuit of a policy of strategic integration into the global economy. The objective here is to participate in the world economy while preserving sufficient policy space to pursue domestic development goals. This policy has bilateral, regional, and multilateral dimensions. Next slide, please. Next slide. At the multilateral level, South Africa is committed to the conclusion of the Doha round on the basis of the development mandate, with the principles of SDT, special and differential treatment, and less than full reciprocity underlying commitments made by developing countries. The TPSF documents note that the lack of progress on the question of agriculture, as well as increasing pressure on emerging economies for greater market access commitments in industrial tariffs and services, contributed to the impasse in the Doha round negotiations from 2008 onwards. South Africa is critical of pressure on emerging economies to graduate on the basis of growth performance when many of these countries have great inequality, poverty, and unemployment challenges despite some exceptional growth performance. The Doha impasse, as mentioned in the introduction, has resulted in a number of trends and challenges that are highlighted in South Africa's trade policy documents. These include the pursuit of plurilateral agreements that South Africa and most other WTO members oppose on the basis that they erode multilateralism, they lack transparency and inclusiveness. Another aspect relates to the policy prescriptions that are associated with the emergence of global value chains, particularly services liberalization and trade facilitation. It is argued that participation in global value chains should not be divorced from industrial policy and broader development goals. We'll return to the recent trends a bit later in the discussion. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you, that's fine. At the regional level, South Africa is engaged in negotiations towards the tripartite FTA between the three regional blocs, SADC, the EAC, and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. The TFTA was launched in June 2015 and is going to begin as a trading goods agreement based on three pillars: market integration, infrastructure development, and industrial development. This is in line with South Africa's developmental integration approach to regional economic integration on the continent. The TFTA is set to form one of the building blocks of a continental free trade area envisaged in the AU's integration agenda. Also on the regional front, South Africa is working with SACU on SACU partners on a 5-point work program to address some of the outstanding issues related to the implementation of the 2002 SACU agreement. We can come back to those later in the discussion if necessary. As far as SADC is concerned, the trade policy documents favour the consolidation of the SADC FTA and a focus on sectoral cooperation, infrastructure and industrial development, using barriers and rules of origin. South Africa is cautious about into a customs union and initially laid out in SADC's integration agenda, the Regional Indicative Strategic Development Program, which has recently been revised. The South African Minister of Trade and Industry has referred to the further development of customs unions as premature and as constraining the country's capacity to use tariffs as instruments for industrial development. Next slide. Similar concerns govern the trade policy and strategy framework approach to interregional and bilateral trade agreements with partners outside the continent. The strategic approach at this level is to negotiate preferential trade agreements, PTAs, that might initially be fairly limited, but then provide an institutional basis from which to develop and consolidate further relations. Examples of this include the 2009 SACU-Mercosur PTA and the proposed SACU-India PTA. This approach explicitly recognizes the need to structure trade and investment relations with developing countries in ways that are sensitive to industrial policy and employment goals. A major concern for South Africa is the replication of traditional north-south trading patterns in the country's trade with emerging economies. We see that exports are dominated by commodities and low value-added products to these emerging market partners, while imports usually comprise higher value-added manufactured goods, although there are differences within the BRICS grouping in this regard. With the growing significance of China and India as individual trading partners, South Africa has signaled its concern about the implications of these trade patterns for its industrial development goals. This concern is reflected in the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement signed with China in 2010. In the economic sphere, this agreement resolves to improve the structure of trade, not just the scale of trade, between South Africa and China in order to achieve a more balanced trading relationship, promoting trade in higher value-added manufactures. Next slide. So from South Africa's perspective then, strategic integration into the global economy should support industrial policy at each level by harnessing trade and investment relations to improve market access. In this regard, other African countries have long been a key destination for South Africa's manufactured exports, and the emphasis on this African market continues in South Africa's post-2009 trade policy documents. But South Africa's trade and industrial policy makers underscore the need for development integration and regional industrial policy to prevent the same imbalances that concern South Africa in its trade with emerging markets being reproduced in its own trade with sub-Saharan Africa. So this highlights the important point that trade expansion in and of itself does not equate to development. Next slide. Next slide. This has implications for all levels of engagement in the trade field. So it has implications for non-agricultural market access negotiations on industrial tariffs at the multilateral level. It has implications for developing country approaches to regional integration and bilateral trade agreements, and also for prospects for moving towards a BRICS-wide market. South Africa's trade policy documents highlight the importance that South Africa attaches to its BRICS membership and outlines the main focal points of its economic engagement with its BRICS partners. These include in particular reform of the global economic and financial architecture, enhanced collaboration with BRICS partners in the Doha round, building trade and investment relations within the grouping that take account of industrial policy goals, and supporting BRICS engagement with the rest of Africa in ways that further the continent's development agenda. Notwithstanding the emphasis on Africa and the BRICS in recent trade policy documents, the continued importance of trade relations with the EU and other developed country partners is highlighted. Current engagement with the US is concerned with securing an extension to South Africa's benefits in AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and there is a limited agreement between SACU and the US called the TIDCA, which focuses on trade and investment facilitation issues. The divisive SADC-EPA negotiations were finally concluded in 2014. The controversial MFN clause will evidently apply to new agreements concluded between SADC-EPA group and Brazil, China, India, and the US. This has implications for any future trade agreements between South Africa and most of its BRICS partners. On the other hand, if trade with the EU is largely duty-free, up to 86% duty-free by the end of the TCA implementation period, then from South Africa's perspective, the problems with the MFN clause would presumably only apply if South Africa wished to grant preferences to affect third countries in the 14% of products that are not covered by the TDCA or the EPA that replaces it. Limited use of export taxes by the SADC-EPA countries has also been negotiated. However, discussions evidently will continue on a more comprehensive EPA, or there's pressure to continue such discussions that includes issues such as services, investment, and competition policy. This raises a number of questions that we return to in the following section. Next slide, please. The next section briefly considers the rationale underlying South Africa's strategic trade and industrial policy position, with a focus on the changing landscape of regional and bilateral trade and investment agreements, as well as the multilateral setting. This discussion will allow us to look at emerging BRICS positions in some of these areas and lessons that can be learned from the South African perspective for the possible creation of a BRICS-wide market and moves to deepen economic cooperation amongst the big BRICS countries. Next slide, please. South Africa's trade and industrial policy position is based on a fundamental critique of orthodox trade theory and its policy prescriptions. The orthodox approach to trade policy makes the case for trade liberalization to improve static allocative efficiency and for dynamic gains from trade. However, looking just at static resource reallocation effects is of little interest in the development context. And in terms of dynamic effects, theoretical models linking trade liberalization and growth provide ambiguous conclusions, and the empirical literature has been subject to extensive critique. Furthermore, it cannot be taken for granted that growth by itself will lead to significant employment creation or meaningful development. Widespread critique signifies that orthodox theory provides an insufficient framework for considering questions of growth and development through industrialization in developing countries. Since 2007, South Africa's trade and industrial policymakers have favored a heterodox approach that recognizes the long-standing argument that the type of products that a country produces is of major importance for development. Output and growth consequences differ significantly for increasing as opposed to decreasing returns activities. South Africa's industrial policy action plan explains the rationale underlying the policy's focus on labor-absorbing industrialization, with an emphasis on value added in manufacturing in particular, but with a recognition of important forward, backward, and side linkages to mining, agriculture, and manufacturing-related services. This rationale includes high growth and employment multipliers in manufacturing subsectors, the importance of manufacturing for the economy's export and balance of payments performance, innovation and productivity growth, as well as economy-wide linkages. The current approach also recognizes, sorry, next slide please. Okay. The current approach also recognizes that the transfer of production technology and other knowledge is not costless or immediate. Technologies are not blueprints that can be costlessly applied elsewhere. Time is needed for learning by doing, investment in developing technological capabilities, and absorbing and adapting technologies. This provides an argument for strategic trade and industrial policy in the current context. Chang argues that not all aspects of a strategic trade and industrial policy can be expected to succeed, but that this does not provide an argument for avoidance. Significant literature emphasizes the way in which failure can be reduced through the strategic use of reciprocal control mechanisms and performance requirements to harness rents, as well as FDI for development. And the work of Alice Anderson and others is important in this regard. Then Fine calls for an inductive approach to industrial policy, arguing that the nature of industrial policy differs by context, sector, and country. Industrial policy should be inductively defined rather than subject to a general definition that is then applied as a one-size-fits-all policy prescription. In this view, industrial policy is derived empirically from case studies of particular sectors of the economy. Policies have both horizontal and vertical dimensions, with horizontal policies prevailing across the economy and vertical policies pertaining to a particular sector and its linkages. This approach informs aspects of South Africa's industrial policy action plans. However, the important point is that the implementation of a strategic trade and industrial policy can be significantly constrained by a lack of coherence between different aspects of economic policy making, particularly with respect to the macroeconomic policy environment, as well as the political settlement in the country. This is a particular feature of the South African political economy, as the work of Nimrod and others have shown. Different approaches across different departments and the dominance of Treasury and the financial sector of the economy more generally affect the ability to coordinate an effective industrial policy. Sorry, I just think I might have lost a slide. All right. No, we're on the right side now. That's not place. Sorry about that. All right. So I think we can have, in addition to the domestic constraints, the wide array of trade and industrial policy instruments have been affected by WTO rules since the conclusion of the Uruguay round. And additionally, the North-South trade agreements have proliferated that induce developing countries to undertake deeper obligations than those required at the multilateral level, particularly in areas such as services, intellectual property protection, and investment policy. Di Maio cautions that the more serious impediments that arise as a consequence of North-South bilateral agreements have caused developing countries to undertake commitments that go beyond their WTO obligations. Both the Doha impasse and the push by the EU and the US for WTO plus provisions in North-South agreements are related to pressure from powerful lobbies in the North for greater market access into the larger emerging market developing economies in particular. In the face of saturated services markets at home and the reorganization of production and exchange globally, the pressure from developed countries also extends to the procurement markets of developing countries. In a context of both trade and financial liberalization, so-called new generation issues such as trade and services, investment, intellectual property protection, public procurement, and competition policy have all been subject to the discourse of liberalization and regulatory reform. From a developing country perspective, however, each of these issues plays a critical role in industrial policy and its articulation with other key areas of economic policy. Next slide, please.
Next slide, please, Moses.
Okay.
Moses, can you just reduce the font a little bit because we're missing out on the heading here? Or you can't change it? Okay.
No, I can't change it.
Sorry.
Are you on slide trade policy and the new generation, trade-related issues?
Yes,
That's fine.
That's right. Yeah.
So developing countries have resisted pressure to negotiate on investment, government procurement, and competition policy in the Doha round, and the three issues were removed from the Doha development agenda in 2004. There's been growing criticism and calls for the revision of GATS, TRIMS, and TRIPS by developing countries. So it's therefore in the context of plurilaterals, regional trade agreements, and international investment treaties that most of these issues are now being taken forward by the developed countries. Trade facilitation was the only one of the four Singapore issues that remained on the Doha development agenda after July 2004. But despite the eventual conclusion of an agreement on trade facilitation in Bali, questions have arisen about the extent to which the trade facilitation agenda coheres with a development agenda in the spirit of the Doha mandate, or whether it forms part of a new trade narrative for further liberalization by developing countries, especially in the field of services. Next slide. Next slide.
Next slide, Morgan.
There we go. Okay.
Slow.
Okay.
With the Doha impasse, there have been a proliferation of international investment treaties and investment chapters in regional trade agreements. The IIAs have become increasingly controversial because of the degree to which regulatory autonomy is eroded, and because of the nature of the investor state dispute mechanisms that allow foreign firms to institute claims against host governments. IIAs can affect the coherence between FDI, industrial and technology policy, as well as important social policy objectives. For example, mineral beneficiation and industrialization efforts may be affected by challenges to tax regimes and policies to promote the developmental benefits of foreign investments, such as requirements to undertake joint ventures, procure inputs locally, transfer technology, or support local R&D may be constrained. Provisions that allow foreign firms to avoid compliance with domestic laws that local investors are subject to, and that allow foreign firms access to a dispute mechanism that is not available to domestic firms, indicate that investment agreements can permit more favorable treatment of foreign over local investors. Gallagher explores the policy space available in international investment agreements to deploy capital controls in financial crises. He finds that trade and investment agreements can significantly affect a country's ability to use capital controls, particularly in the case of US agreements, but also where countries have made specific financial services commitments in the GATT. The issue of investment arbitration, the investor-state dispute mechanisms allow foreign firms to institute claims against host governments, which have on many occasions been related to or targeted against public policies, and the costs to the developing countries have been high. Most of the claims instituted have been against developing countries, far in excess of their share of world inward investment. South Africa's policy response has been not to renew a number of bilateral investment treaties and to develop a domestic legislative framework that protects both local and foreign investment that takes account of domestic policy goals and the right to regulate in the public interest. A number of developed and developing countries, not just South Africa, have reconsidered their international investment treaties in recent years. Reviews have occurred in Australia, Canada, Brazil, India, Norway, the EU and US during the past decade, as well as in South Africa. While some countries have terminated or opted not to renew international investment agreements because they interfere with attaining domestic public policy objectives, and because of disagreement with the investor-state dispute mechanism, others have argued that the system could be reformed by reviewing the text of agreements and the arbitration system. However, a number of countries, including South Africa, have found insufficient evidence that investment agreements promote inward investment in excess of what could have occurred, what would have occurred in their absence. Next slide, please. Sorry, you can't see the heading there. The heading there is public procurement, the next new generation issue. Growing literature is emerging on the implications for development policy of multilateral and regional bilateral rules in areas such as services, investment, competition policy, and trade facilitation. Less work appears to have been done on the impact of international rules and disciplines in the field of government procurement, and specifically on the use of public procurement as a policy tool in developing countries. This area is of significant interest, however, since procurement markets comprise as much as 15 to 20% of GDP in both developed and developing countries. For many countries, public procurement is one remaining policy tool in a rapidly shrinking development policy toolkit, and public procurement policy also has important linkages with investment, innovation, industrial, and social policies. In this context, the implications for development policy of increasing pressures for multilateral and North-South regional bilateral commitments in the field of public procurement are worth considering. The WTO Government Procurement Agreement is a plurilateral agreement that has been in existence for some time, but which few developing countries have signed. Only a quarter of OECD WTO countries have signed 1994. Developing country participation is largely limited to EU transition economies, but there are a number of developing countries that are amongst the GPA observer nations, with China and Panama currently negotiating accession. There are no independent ACP or Latin American signatories at present. Cameroon is the only African country with observer status. The most recent revision of the GPA entered into force in April 2014 and provides for an expanded coverage of government entities and services and a new provision on corruption. The new GPA includes improved transitional measures, quote, to try and encourage developing countries to join. As with the case of trade liberalization more generally, there's often a presumption that open procurement markets are the appropriate benchmark for developing countries to strive towards. From a development perspective, however, there's a significant literature that considers public procurement as one of the most important remaining policy tools. And it is indeed a policy tool that the US has used a lot, both protecting its home market from a procurement point of view while pursuing market opening abroad. In South Africa, public procurement is an important part of the industrial policy action plan sector strategy, and there are important linkages to technology policy via public procurement for innovation. Next slide, please. The last point in this section relates to South Africa's approach to economic integration as a tool of industrial policy and development policy more generally. The underlying framework, or the underlying argument, is that economic integration needs to move beyond the inappropriate promotion of orthodox linear model of market integration to take into account the problems of integration among countries at unequal levels of development. The traditional approach to analyzing economic integration doesn't take consideration of financial liberalization and broader macroeconomic aspects. And the market integration approach needs to be critiqued when attempting to integrate countries at unequal levels of development. Next slide, please. I'm going to summarize the section on recent trends and challenges because of the time constraints. If you just move straight on to the next slide. The next slide. Sorry, with the Doha impasse, two key aspects that have emerged have been the the tendency towards negotiating plurilateral trade agreements within the WTO, as well as the emergence of the mega-regional trade negotiation. The plurilateral trade negotiations have been opposed by most developing countries, pushed by a strong US lobby. Existing plurilateral includes the government procurement agreement, and there is a trade and services plurilateral that is currently under negotiation. The criticism is that these approaches undermine the single undertaking by delinking negotiations from agriculture and other Doha development issues. In the case of TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, proposals for financial services liberalization seem set to constrain the ability of participating countries to re-regulate finance post the global financial crisis. Next slide, please. We've already mentioned that in the context of the trade facilitation debate and global value chains, work on measuring trade in terms of value added by the OECD and WTO has been accompanied by a narrative that the emergence of global value chains provides a compelling reason for countries to have more open trade policies. You've mentioned that South Africa's position is critical of this narrative, which is seen as a way to enhance a wholesale liberalization agenda extended to services. Rather, developing countries should consider imaginative ways of forwarding their trade and industrial policy agendas in the context of global value chains. There's an extensive related literature on power relations and industrial policy in the global value chain context. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, that's fine. Just briefly on the mega-regionals, there have been recent developments with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that I'm looking at the moment. But the basic point on the mega-regionals is that they introduce an agenda for regulatory convergence with characteristics that go even beyond some of the WTO plus provisions that we find in the economic partnership agreements and international investment agreements. Alongside regulatory convergence in the usual areas such as trade in goods and services, on investment, the US is pushing the investor-state dispute settlement in financial services, and the US position on capital controls in the mega-regional trade negotiations seems to be even more restrictive than in its other trade and investment agreements, despite the lessons of the global financial crisis. In addition, increasing intellectual property protection is a prominent feature of the mega-regionals. But what is different to other agreements, North-South trade and investment agreements, is the provisions for the operation of state-owned enterprises in the mega-regional trade negotiations. This seems to be unprecedented, and the US appears to be proposing competitive neutrality between SOEs and private sector firms, which would affect, for example, loans on beneficial terms and public procurement policies and a host of other development policies. Agriculture is off the table in the mega-regionals, so these so-called modern agreements are very selective and focused on areas of interest to developing countries. I'll just wrap up with the last section. Next slide, please. Right, that heading is Lessons for the BRICS Cooperation Agenda. This section considers emerging BRICS positions in some of these areas and the lessons that the BRICS grouping could learn from South Africa's perspectives and policy positions in these areas. An examination of the BRICS statements and communiques indicates or suggests that there are clear common positions between the BRICS countries on the criticism of the developed country policy responses to global crisis. There seem to be common positions on reform of the global economic and financial architecture, especially the IMF, that the BRICS countries support a continued central role for WTO and a greater role for UNCTAD. However, In the BRICS, in the context of the BRICS grouping, joint positions on plurilateral agreements, mega-regionals, and international investment agreements are much less clear. In addition, joint BRICS positions on strategic tariff policy, well, there isn't one, and there are tensions evident within the BRICS grouping on the use of trade remedies. Although the BRICS documents do emphasize the development of value-added trade relations, there's no explicit discussion of industrial policy. In fact, I don't think in any of the documents, BRICS documents that I looked at, that I saw the phrase industrial policy once. Work is needed on the industrial policies of the member countries and on prospects for intra-industry trade specialization within the BRICS countries, as well as on the trade and industrial policy implications of global value chains and the trade facilitation agenda, as well as other new generation trade issues. Next slide, please. A joint policy response needs to be worked on with respect to plurilaterals, mega-regionals, and policy space. However, there seem to be divergences amongst the BRIC countries in this regard. On international investment agreements, we've spoken about South Africa's policy position. Brazil is also very cautious about, it didn't have any bilateral investment treaties. It's recently signed bilateral investment treaties with Angola and Mozambique, which, if you look at the texts of the agreements, are very much new generation bits, which have provisions which allow for the regulation of investment in the public interest and address a number of concerns of the first generation bits. So in the final, okay, that's the final slide. The question then is, given that in a number of important policy areas, such as plurilateral trade agreements, international investment agreements, and various other areas, there are divergent views within the BRICS grouping. Questions that arise include whether South-South developmental integration is an instrument of trade and industrial policy in the BRICS context. Regional policy and regional cooperation within the grouping is not the same thing as regional liberalization, although some of the documents do speak of market liberalization as the way forward. First, it is important for countries to establish appropriate national and policies and regulatory frameworks in these areas. Development finance institutions would be an important part of such a program, with cooperation amongst development banks in the BRICS countries and the new development bank. So the basic question then is how we can extend the idea of a strategic trade and industrial policy effectively to the broader BRICS level to drive development. So, thanks. Okay. Sorry for going up.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, well, I'm not going to try and attempt to summarize this. To say that Nikki has covered quite extensively all the key areas about starting essentially from South Africa's trade policy and strategic strategy framework, and covered global integration, and she's covered the rationale for South Africa's policy and cooperation within BRICS, and looked at some key areas such as the impasse in Doha and the proliferation of bilaterals, etc., and see how from this emerges some of the agreements within BRICS itself and the attempts within BRICS to try and organize themselves, but missing some of the key areas in that agreement, such as industrial policy, and how BRICS can kind of find some complementarities amongst each other for taking on industrial policy. And perhaps a big question then she asked at the end is how can we extend the idea of strategic alignment within BRICS for some of the questions that need to be focused, that we need to focus with respect to trade. I'm just going to now open up for discussion, and then after that I'll make one or two announcements. So let's start with Pretoria first. If you're able to pick up, we will make these papers available on the South African BRICS think tank working paper series. So if you go to the South African BRICS think tank working paper series, if you go to the South African BRICS think tank website, you will get a lot of the documents from the academic forum anyway. But we will, after the authors have done some editing, we will then put them up as working paper series on the South African BRICS think tank website. So more work for you. Okay, so let's have some questions quickly. By the way, you can eat while question. I don't know if there are sandwiches on that side, Moses and Arlene, but I'm sure there must be.
Yeah, we'll have food afterwards.
Oh, you have food afterwards. Okay, so don't make people starve. Okay, let's have some questions. Are there any questions on that side? Okay. Please announce your name and institution if you're not from the HSRC.
We don't have any question for now, Jaya.
Okay, from Cape Town. Are we so overwhelmed? Too much to digest? Yeah? Please give your name.
Shane Godfrey from University of Cape Town. I just wanted to, what extent the issue of labour market regulation and labour standards have come up, both in terms of the ECA, SEDEC, and ESA developments, as well as in BRICS, and harmonisation of labour market regulation and standards.
Okay, we can take more and then from that, or we can answer. Okay, one person in Durban. Do you have a question? Okay. Nimro? Okay. You want to answer that in the meantime?
Well, the short answer is I haven't come across anything. I haven't come across anything in the BRICS documents on harmonization of labour standards, and I can imagine that would be a very kind of, difficult one to address. So in the summit statements that I've looked at, and in the trade and the other documents, the trade and investment cooperation framework documents, and so on and so forth, I haven't come across anything that suggests that anything like that is envisaged. With respect to the TFTA, well, only the phase 1 negotiations, well, they haven't even yet been completed, but that's what's in progress at the moment. So only once that is done and has been implemented, and that's trading goods with the tariff offers and so on and so forth. Only once that is done will countries then be obliged to engage in phase 2 negotiations in the TFTA, which would then include services and certain other areas. Once again, I haven't seen labour standards on that agenda either. I might be wrong on that.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Bill Freund at UKZN. Hello, Nikki.
Hi, Bill.
I was thinking that this is a very complicated subject, and one of the things you need to kind of cross-reference this with is the actual trade patterns of different BRICS countries, because their needs and their emphases must be by no means the same. And I'm very glad you brought up the question of South African relations with the region and, well, at least the southern half of Africa, because that gives a totally different dimension again. So there's a question to me of, the need really to calibrate all these things in order to have the policies we want. I don't know if the statistical information, etc., is good enough for that. How do you feel we're doing in terms of understanding this issue?
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, please go ahead.
As far as the trade statistics are concerned, we've got quite good trade data. You're completely right. The trade patterns of the different BRICS countries are very different. If you just look at it from South Africa's perspective, its trade relations. It's trade. The trade patterns with China and India are very. I mean, I've only looked at the figures in a preliminary kind of way. I had an honest student working on this. But certainly you see the export of raw materials and the import of manufactured goods very evident in trade with India and China. And interestingly, a bit less so with Brazil. So there is more interchange of manufactured products, just at a first glance. More interchange of manufactured products with Brazil, although the trade is smaller. The value of trade as a whole is smaller with Brazil than with China and India. But it seems to be of a different pattern. And obviously, as I mentioned, South Africa's trade relations with the region. The region is a very important market for our manufactured products. I did read a study that looked at South Africa's trade with the EU relative to its trade with its BRICS partners. And that study concluded that South Africa's trade with the EU had more interchange of manufactured products than its trade with the BRICS partners. Obviously, with the latter being overwhelmed by trade with China. So that was an interesting finding. But one has to look at the level of aggregation in that study, whether it was disaggregated enough, whether it was an appropriate level of aggregation to draw conclusions about two-way trade in a product category or inter-industry trade. So yes, there's a lot of scope for work to be done, and the work needs to be done. Also on investment relations, what kind of investments are taking place between the countries of BRICS group, and into which sectors. So we're working on it.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah. Tell me your name.
Mario Jacobs, also with LNP at UCT. Just perhaps to further expand on the question posed by saying earlier, my own experience is that there's been recent media reports about human rights violations of Brazilian companies in Angola. Human rights violations in the form of labor rights not being protected. In fact, in as much as it is regulated by legislation in Angola, Brazilian companies are not honoring the terms of those legislative rights enshrined in legislation. Now those media reports could certainly be made available, but I'm sure it is accessible. Now, there's one thing that is of interest, and I think much has already been said about the trading relation and what would form the basis of the trade relation between South Africa and other BRICS countries, and then vis-a-vis South Africa and SADC countries. Now, one's experience, or my own experience, is that the basis of the trade relations between, in particular, South Africa and China and India, is that of the exportation of raw material. And precisely for that reason, many would argue that there's been a dip in the economic activity or economic growth, and that is because of the dip in Chinese economy. The raw material argument certainly would hold so far as that is concerned. What I'm concerned about is when specific reference is made to linkages with the mining, or between mining and manufacturing, because that will certainly then cement the argument that people like Ben Fine and others are making, that problem with the South African economy is because of its linkage with the MEC, and because any form of economic activity does not go beyond, or certainly does not go sufficiently beyond the minerals energy complex, which brings about lesser growth patterns within the South African economy, which created a situation where South African companies are over-concentrating, I would argue, in the southern region than in the local market as a means of extracting greater levels of profit margins. Then perhaps your views on that.
So,
Go ahead.
so the 2 points there. The first of all, on the newspaper articles, I haven't seen those. Thanks. I'll look for them on the labour rights by violations of labour rights by Brazilian companies in Angola. So that's quite interesting. These I mentioned earlier that Brazil hasn't signed any of these bilateral investment treaties to date, but it does. It has a couple that it's or they classified as other international investment agreements that have to be on untapped database, and they've now actually signed a number in 2015. One with Malawi, one with Angola, one with Mozambique. So what I will do, and what will be interesting to do, is to look at the provisions of those treaties. And they're bound to say something about, or they should, I imagine, say something about those rights, because they are, as I said, these new generation international investment treaties. So that'll be very interesting to look at, and I'll look that up. Thanks for that. On the South African trading patterns, well, I haven't done enough work to comment properly on South Africa's exports to the rest of SADC, in recent years. It's been some time since I've looked at those figures. I had a look at the trade figures with China, India, and Brazil recently, and it bears out what you say in terms of exporting the raw materials to China and India, and also the enormous increase in the volume of that value of that trade. So my sense is that in those three bilateral trading relationships, SA Brazil, SA China, SA India, you see very much South Africa being stuck in its MEC sectors, even when it's going beyond the raw materials into the slightly value added. It's still all fine steel products and that sort of thing. So they're very much a feature of those trading relations. So I need to catch up and have a proper look at the exports to the new region, which I haven't worked on for a while. Yeah. So, but it does seem that diversification beyond the MSC sectors is not a great feature of our exports to our BRICS partners.
I just had a question that I neglected to pose earlier. When I looked at GDP, both in relation to so the industry has a contribution to GDP as well as employment within the major economic industrial activities. And South Africa's economic structure is akin to that of a developed country. Highly service sector, a shrinking industrial base, shrinking agricultural base. Now the question is, if we are seeking to re-engineer our manufacturing sector, why are we seeing such a significant dip in the industrial base or the manufacturing base of the economic sector?
Well, we're suffering from what Gabriel Palmer called premature deindustrialization. So much of the source of that lies in the previous trade and industrial policy strategies pre-NRPA, or the National Industrial Policy Plan. So if you look back to the extensive liberalization that took place in the 1990s, as well as the inadequate supply-side industrial policy measures and incoherent and dispersed industrial policy measures that were a feature of the policy at that time. That obviously plays a role. The role of the financial sector has been very important. The whole financialization of the economy has been important. The global financial crisis, as well as the commodity boom and the demand by countries like China for our resources, which I mean, you know, you've seen a similar thing in Brazil. Well, it's different, but it's similar. There's certain features that are the same. I mean, Brazil has become a major exporter, you know, to manufacture, you know, gone back to kind of primary product exporting in a way. Yeah, so the variety of factors.
I think just two more issues on that particular thing is the serious investment strike for South African investors sitting with
One
burden.
with financialization.
The serious financialization of the financial sector. But the second thing is our own domestic demand. So those two issues on a macroeconomic level, I think they're very important for the high levels of debt, the high interest rates, etc. All contributed factors to that. I mean, we're not going to get this. We have one of the highest levels of capital flight from the country, and that's all linked to the financialization, international financialization. And I think then fine, somebody else recently did a paper on that. So you know, I think those are some of the key things. Okay, are there any questions? Okay, number one.
I mean, I just want to comment on this NEC story because I think that it's kind of classic quite clear sort of literally from early 20th century to the late 19th century. I think subsequently things have gotten a lot messier because a lot of interlinked things have been happening simultaneously, including underinvestment and kind of decline in some of the historically core parts of the NEC itself. So steel is an example, automotives on the electricity sector. And then parallel there's been, and I don't think unrelated, there's been a lot of growth, saying consumption related sectors, the extension of finance credit to households playing a very important role. But I think that collectively these things have added up to something close to perfect storm form. Let's call it downstream diversified manufacturing. You know, whether it's the capital flows for a long period, moving relative prices against manufacturing, whether it's internal pricing to manufacturing, you know, whether it's credit, the way in which credit extension to households has helped to some increase. So these things have worked in a, I mean, you know, notwithstanding their messiness, they work together to really constrain growth in diversified manufacturing.
Okay, have we got any more questions from Pretoria? No questions. Moses?
Yes.
No.
You okay?
Yes, you're okay.
Okay, one more from Cape Town. Looks like Cape Town is outperforming you guys. Come on.
Hi, I'm Akiko and I from the Japanese Institute for Videoconferencing and Clay at the University.
Which university? Stellenbosch University. Okay.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I'd like to have some two questions. One is the regional integration is based on the key focus is the value chain. And my question is in African integration there is no it doesn't create the value chain in the among members. How do you think this will because without such a value chain the integration doesn't work well. So, but the Asian integration or American integration can increase or can create a new value chain. So how is the difference? Why is the difference? Or is there some possibility to create some value chain in Africa? And the second is trade agreement. Uh, the trade of the current trade agreement has some social provisions like environmental provisions relating to the labors and other new issues included in the trade agreement. Other than the issues that relate directly relate to the trade. But at some point, environment or the social issues like labor issues included in the agreement to agreement. Do you think these provisions can work well so far? Because only the provisions exist in the trade agreement, but these provisions might make the rules fragmented. So if it doesn't work well, I think the trade agreement shouldn't include any other related issues. So how do you think
Are you talking about a particular trade agreement or just in general?
in general?
The first point on the regional value chains, I think certainly the integration agenda has not focused much on the regional value chains, but that's changed a lot in the last little while. There's a lot of work being done by on regional value chains in Africa, in the Southern African region. And there's a big project that I think the WTO is involved in that regard, looking at value chains with in the mining sector, and the clothing sector, and so on and so forth. So there's work, and that work will start to come out very soon. It's very interesting because it's very important in the context of the whole value chain narrative globally, and also in the light of the East Asian experience, where the sense that all came before formal agreements were signed. In our way, it's the other way around in our region. And then the second point, well, I think much of the regional bilateral trade agreements is very much because those agreements often pressure developing countries that are not ready to undertake commitments in certain new areas that have not even been properly negotiated at the WTO level, and in areas where perhaps national and south regional frameworks have not yet been sorted out. So yes, I'm very wary about the new issues, particularly North-South trade agreements and how they are used to extract concessions or commitments from developing countries that might further strengthen development process rate.
Especially the North-South agreement, especially research treatment, doesn't cover North-South agreement, only South-South treatment. So if the developing countries want to conclude some agreement with the developed countries, then the developing countries should take any responsibility to environmental issues or labor issues. Other than these issues, doesn't cover WTO doesn't negotiate. I'm so skeptical and worried about it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end. We've actually gone above time. But I think we've had a very useful discussion. And I just want to make an announcement. We're having 2 more BRICS seminars this year, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, one on the 10th of November by Professor Rasigan Maharaj on challenges for ICT governance, which will be taken again looking at ICT governance within BRICS. And he's going to talk about many issues, including cyberspace security and other issues that have become quite pronounced recently. And then on the 17th of November, we are Nanya Professor Bola Muller, who will be talking about building a fair world order, again within BRICS. So these are the two seminars, next seminars for the BRICS we have in mind. And like I said, many of these papers have been presented at the academic forum in Moscow this year, and we will have them on our South African BRICS website so that you can pick them up as working papers. Eventually, they probably will be published also in academic journals. So thank you very much for your participation, and thank you for coming. Look forward to seeing you again. Have some lunch. The constraints, but I thought we had that discussion.
Yeah.
So,